So where do we start telling my life? I guess we'll start at the beginning. I was born in the mid-'70s to a middle-class family in suburban Tulsa, Oklahoma. Shortly after that, after I was born, we moved to a small farming community just outside of town, had a little bit of land. I think we even had a horse, if I remember right. I can barely remember that because I think it was right up until I started school in kindergarten that we lived out there. And I can remember a few things, but what I do remember is my parents taking us to church. They taught Sunday school in church, in the local church there. I don't recall the name of it, but I remember them teaching Sunday school and us going. And then we moved to Tulsa, and we kind of lost connection with the home church. As we grew up, my parents still went periodically to different churches, but the world and life kind of gets in the way sometimes, and you get busy. Growing up, I was always a believer, and I can always remember praying every night. It was usually the same prayer, and I think it went something to the effect of, "Lord, please don't let me die tonight." That was my prayer growing up. I was terrified of dying for some reason, but I also think I really didn't know what everything was about. But I always believed in God, and I believed in Jesus, and I don't know where I got the stories from. I'm sure it was sometime when I was sitting in Sunday school with my parents teaching, or my parents teaching at home. But we didn't go to church, I remember, growing up much. We'd moved back to Tulsa about kindergarten. I can maybe remember a handful of times going, and I think my parents went periodically, but I would go on in the summers for vacation Bible school with my cousin usually. They went to a Methodist church. And I spent most summers, 1 week a summer in vacation Bible school. Back then it was during the day. And I remember having to get up early in the summer, and I never liked it, but I always had a good time when I went. And we'd go to the Hanging of the Greens. I remember they always did a play and a Hanging of Greens around Christmas time. And as I got older and lost friends in life through tragedies and stuff, and as I sat there and really looked, and as I started to grow, I was still a believer, but I wasn't really in church. We didn't go to church. I mean, we went for Easter and Mother's Day, Father's Day, stuff like that, but I don't remember going on a regular basis. But I do remember one time when I was about 14 years old. I was standing on the street corner in my neighborhood, and a guy shows up, and my parents had gone to a new church. I think it was Church on the Move back then. It still is, but I think that's where they had gone. And I remember this guy coming up and introducing himself, and he was young. Couldn't have been much more older than I was at the time, maybe 20 or so. But I remember him talking to me about Jesus a little bit, and I remember standing there on the street corner. My buddies were just behind me, but we were talking, and he invited me to say the sinner's prayer, or the whatever you want to call it now. A lot of the prayer that people believe is what gets us saved. But it's based on Romans, and so it's accurate. And I remember he asked me if I wanted to say it, and I said yes, and I remember saying it right then. I guess that was the first time I really would be considered saved. I wasn't baptized. I still didn't go to church. I still continued to pray every day. But that was the first time I would say I was really taught to on my level about God and about Jesus and about salvation. So technically, I guess you could say I was saved at 14. Now, being saved at 14 and being a follower, I think I was a believer, but I don't know that I was really a follower, so to speak. But I still went, and I remember, Mother's Day, always going to church and going to breakfast and stuff like that. But I remember, as I got older, into high school, and I remember I got into the party scene for a while, and with drinking, and there was a lot of people using drugs around me. But we would go out and have parties almost every weekend, doing things that shouldn't have been doing. You know, I see a lot of people now that really got hurt by that, and things that could have happened that only by the grace of God didn't happen. And that's really the hard part to realize if you look at it, because I lost a very good friend when I think I was 15, 16 years old because of that kind of lifestyle. And it's hard when you think back and you realize that could have been me. And I remember finding out what had happened and just thinking, well, that he was supposed to come over that weekend. That could have been me. That could have been. I mean, I didn't do the same things he did, but it's so close it could have happened. You know, as I went through high school, I had friends from all different groups. I had, you know, every type of stereotypical high school person there was. I had a friend that was one of those. Whether it be from the pot smokers to the jocks to the cowboys to the gearheads to you name it, I had a friend in one form or another that was in one of those groups, which made it really nice because that was my goal, was to be friends with as many people as I could. It allowed me to get into all the parties, no matter who was hosting them. We were able to go. I was never good at getting by on my parents with stuff. I always got caught for the things I did. In fact, I remember having a party one time at the house. So it was one of those things that, you know, I knew I shouldn't have been doing it, and I shouldn't have been around the things that I was around. And it was something inside me, you know, was telling me to stop doing it. And it was funny because, well, it wasn't really funny, but it was one of those things I just didn't even realize, you know, how close I could have came all those times for all those different reasons to either being dead or not really being saved. And that's scary as I look back, you know, 20, 30 years later, looking back on my life now, you realize the chances you run with the things that you do even when you're younger. It was about 1997 when I got hired on at the sheriff's office. Now, mind you, for me to work at the sheriff's office was exciting. I'd gone through the tour, I'd gone through the academy, I was really looking forward to it. Now, I'd been in a total of maybe 2 fights in high school. I wasn't a fighter. I knew friends that would go to bars and stuff just to fight. I was never that type. I just wanted to go to have fun. And my first experience in the county, my first day once I've got out of the academy, was a fight with a guy on PCP. You know, I've heard stories about people and the effects of drugs on them, but I'd never really lived that up close to them. But when I saw it and had to deal with it hands-on right then, it was a culture shock for me at the time. It's not who I was. It wasn't where I came from, and it was interesting. You know, when I was working for the sheriff's office, we continued the party lifestyle. After hours, we would all go hang out either at a bar or a restaurant, and we'd go, you know, do whatever. We were young. We were 20 years old, 21 years old, and we went out and did things that we thought every other 21-year-old had done. But we always kept in mind of who we were and who we worked for, and so we made sure that the things we did wouldn't cause a bad reflection on the department, because that's how much we cared about it. I can remember every detention officer's dream was to go to the academy, and to go to the academy was our ultimate goal. And you had to have college, you had to have all this stuff. And I remember there was guys that did something heroic or something outstanding, and they actually sometimes got to go without that. I saw a lot of evil in the sheriff's office. I saw firsthand what evil looks like in someone's face. And I remember a guy coming in, and I don't remember what he was charged with, but I remember him coming in and just the sheer look of terror and evil in his eyes. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen in my life. And we'd seen evil. We've seen the murders. The murders would come in and they would appear like normal people, but some of these guys would come in with straight evil and this almost possession look on their face. It really kind of a wake-up call to what's out there, what we're really experiencing, what people are really seeing, and this whole idea that the spiritual level is more than what we realize. And I remember those people. I remember the funny ones as much as I remember the scary ones, but I remember never really being intimidated by anyone who'd actually committed murder. But I remember the guy that came in that had that look on his face, and I could never describe it, but I can still picture it in my mind today, a pure look of evil, and it was probably the most horrifying thing I dealt with during that time. So I got a lot of exposure with those types of people and the way they acted and who they were, and to see that sometimes that this evil really is out there, because a lot of times we don't see it. In this world, we look at things that are going on. We see it on the news, but we don't see the people that you're dealing with, and the people that are committing these crimes. And to watch them and be hands-on, face-to-face with them and dealing with them was eye-opening to me. I went on from the sheriff's office and got my first field position. I was out working the streets, and I loved it. I was young. I was single. My whole life was my job. I went out to work. I worked extra. I worked over. I was constantly at work doing something because I loved it and I believed in what I was doing. I believed that I was helping people and I was making a difference in the community that I worked in. And that all came to it still kept going even when I met my first wife. We fell in love like we thought anyways. And I remember we had some struggles shortly after we got married. My son was born, my oldest son, and he was born I think 6 weeks premature. And I can remember spending a week in the hospital, and the first time I've ever saw him, he had tubes and things run out of his head. And I remember he was so little, and I remember breaking down and crying when I saw him, because I thought, what did I do wrong for him to be in that position? I mean, I had gone through a lot of stuff in my life. I had dealt with a lot of things. I'd seen a lot of things. I'd done a lot of things I wasn't proud about. But to see my little boy sitting there with these tubes in his head and not being able to do anything was crushing. He was only in the hospital about a week, and his biggest struggle at the time was just making sure he ate enough, and I thought that week would never end, or however long it was. I remember it seeming like forever, and they didn't give you any answers. They didn't tell you what was going on. They just told you, they're sick and they've got certain markers they got to reach, and they put them in incubators. You didn't know anything. But I remember how difficult that week was, and the relief on the day we finally got to take him home. And I didn't realize then, but I remembered that time, and I remembered that stress, that years later I'd have to face it again. I say we fell in love with my first wife. We thought it was. We were both young. And over the years and over the stresses we dealt with a lot, I remember a time when shortly after my son was born, we were living in a house in Owasso, and we were told we had to move out. It was the people that owned it were coming back, and we didn't know what we was going to do, so we started looking for a place, and you're looking for rentals, and we got this new baby, and my oldest daughter, who came from my first wife, we just had a small family, and we're trying to find our way in what we're going to do and try to find a home for these children. Where we had to move out, and I remember my in-laws at the time had a travel trailer, and they offered to put it up on some land so we'd have a place to stay while we found a place to live. And I don't know if you've ever lived in one of those, but it's tight with a newborn baby that's just starting to walk, and all of us, and in the middle of an Oklahoma summer. It gets pretty hot, but looking back, we were blessed to be able to have that, because there's a lot of people that don't. But we saw the struggle, and shortly after that, she lost her job. And I remember thinking, how are we going to make it with a car payment, insurance, food, all that stuff? How are we going to do that with this newborn baby and my daughter? What are we going to do? And I remember praying. I remember some things. I'm sure my parents did a lot of praying for us, but we had a place to live. It wasn't the greatest accommodations, but it was something, and a lot of people don't even have that, and I should have been thankful then. I should have been praising for the things that I had at that point. Eventually we moved into a manufactured home and had a little more room, and we're still in the same place, and we'd gone through some things, and I remember one day driving down 19th Street in Collinsville. I couldn't have been mid-20s at the time. And I remember hearing this voice, and it said to me, "Go tell the people to look for me even in times of trial," or something to that effect. I can still remember to this day, and I was passing a church on 19th Street. And as I passed that church, it said it again. And I thought, it almost like God speaking to me, go tell this to these people. I'm thinking, man, I'm 20-something years old. They ain't going to listen to me. They're not going to listen to me at all. So I drove on past, and I didn't think twice about it after that. I mean, I felt a little guilt, because I really felt that was God at that time telling me to go share this message. Because shortly after that, I really felt in my spirit that God said, you're looking at your problems and you're not looking at the solutions that I've provided. And what I didn't see at the time, and it wasn't until that moment that I really came clear, was, if my wife at the time would have lost her job and we'd still been in the house, we'd have lost the house anyways. And this gave us a way, though we lost the house, but it gave us something better eventually. I mean, at first we didn't think it was better, and I can remember scraping enough money together, because we figured out that on $5 you could feed a family of 4 at McDonald's back then, and that's what we did a lot of. We had enough for groceries. We always met our bills, and I know that was a lot of my parents praying, and a lot of the family praying for us at that time. The hardest part about that story, about the whole story, is the day I was told that she wanted a divorce. And I remember I just got back from training in Kansas City. I'd been gone for a weekend, or 3 or 4 days, I can't remember what, but I come back, and she all kind of laid it out there. What do? You have your children, and the first thing that I thought of was, how will I ever see them? What's going to happen next? What and where and how the world was spinning. I had to break it to my parents. I felt like a failure as a person, that I couldn't keep a marriage together, and I don't know what I did or what happened, but I felt like a failure. And it was a few months before I finally found a place to live and got moved out. And when I did, I had an apartment, and looking back now, we were much better friends. Now we're still friends to this day. Not just because we have kids, but my wife now and her husband now we're all good friends. And it's funny that we were terrible as spouses, but we're great as friends and great as co-parents, and raising our children up. Never thought about anything about the past and what the problems we had, because that was the past and we had to put it behind us. But that all came months, years later, after the divorce, or after the separation. I remember for the first probably 3 months, I sat in my apartment. I had this little apartment above some shops in downtown Skiatook, and I don't think I left it other than to go to work for a good 3 months and to get my kids. You know, I was blessed that she was willing to let us both be parents, and we had them equal amount of time their whole lives. After that divorce, and when I kind of rededicated myself to I just figured I'd dedicate myself to my children and my job. I had nothing else to do. I didn't have any desire to get married again. I had no desire to even look for a long time. And I dedicated myself to work and my kids. And over time, you know, seeing the things that we see on a daily basis, I can remember so much of it. The killings. Watched a guy one time. We got a call of a shooting in progress, and while me and my partners were driving down the road to the shooting, I remember pulling up in the driveway and seeing a body there on the ground, and I pulled up and I see this guy off to the side in a tractor, and he was an older man and he looked like a grandpa. And I thought maybe he saw who did this. As I opened the door and my partner gets out, I was training a new reserve, or I had a reserve with me, and he starts to get out. And in the split second, and I'm from me to this wall from the guy, I'm close. And I see him swing a shotgun around, and I pull my partner down because I want to get under cover. And I see him put that gun under his chin and pull the trigger. And if you've ever seen the movies where there's a pink mist, that's true. I still picture to this day this thing flipping back and flying off into the distance, and not really knowing what it was, but thinking everything kind of slowed down for that moment. And it was a fraction of a second, but it seemed like it flipped and flipped and flew for a long time. It wasn't until probably months later that I found out he was wearing earmuffs, and it was a dispute over 3 feet of fence, and he killed 3 people and then himself when we got there. He could have just as easily turned the gun on us. You know, over the years, I'd seen a lot of terrible things. I've seen bad car wrecks, people crushed and killed. I've seen people abused and children abused, you know, both physically and sexually. I've seen so much over the years. So much pain, so much problems. You tend to build up walls. You build up these walls around you that, because of, you know, the things you see, the way people are, and the things that they do, and you see this day in and day out. And don't let people fool you. Just because you're in a small community doesn't mean they don't happen. It happens every day. And sometimes it's worse than some of the bigger communities. But to sit there and see it every day, nonstop. I mean, there's some intermixed good stuff in there periodically. There were some good things every now and then, but more than likely, more and more, we were there on the worst day of people's lives. And it starts to grow on you after a while. You become hardened to the world. You can't imagine that people don't see this. I still can't imagine that people leave their cars unlocked and their keys in their cars, but it still happens. We see so much negativity and deadly divisiveness, terrible things day in and day out, and we still have people here that are feel safe enough to leave their keys in their cars, and we just don't understand it. You know, I met my next wife, and I remember when we first started seeing each other, I told her, I said, I'll never get married. I'd never get married. In fact, I wasn't even fully divorced from my wife. I didn't believe in divorce at the time, and I told her that if she wanted a divorce, she had to file it. It was probably 5 years later when I met, it's probably 3 years later when I met Melanie. And we talked and we saw each other, but I wasn't going to get married. Not me, not again. I failed once, I was good. It was a couple years after that, I think she somehow tricked me into marrying her. She promised me a trip and said, hey, let's go to Jamaica. Oh, by the way, we're getting married. And we had it really good. Growing up in a blended family, or I wasn't in a blended family, but we had my son and my daughter, and now introducing Melanie into this mix, and they were a little protective of me. They wasn't really sure what to think. I think they were looking out for Dad. My kids were, and they were a little tough on her for a few years, many years actually. But we ended up getting married, and I remember that while we were together, everything was going really well, and our relationship was growing, and we were doing. But I remember around this time, I started really getting into the beauty of nature. I remember seeing the Oklahoma sunsets with the clouds and the reds and the pinks and the oranges, the beautiful colors. I remember seeing these things, just anything. I would see the beauty in stuff, and I'd like to think it was partially because of my wife that I was seeing the beauty in life again, rather than just the negative and the bad stuff. But I was searching for something, and I didn't realize at the time what I was searching for. Around this time that I got into photography, was taking pictures a lot, taking pictures of different places. I had a camera and did like time lapse of sunsets. We had great sunsets nearby where we were living, and we were living in a house at this point in Collinsville, and had this wide open area to the west, and you could sit out there with a camera and just record the sunsets. And we'd do it in a time lapse, so it'd make it look really fast. But I really got into that. And what I didn't realize is what I was seeking. I was looking for something. And it wouldn't be till years later that I figured out what that was. In 2010, my next son was born. I remember when Melanie found out she was pregnant, and the excitement of the pregnancy and that whole deal goes out. And I remember towards the end, it was summertime and it's hot, and she was miserable, and we go to the lake and swim, but it was hot. And it's just an Oklahoma summer. It got really hot, and she was miserable. And I remember her saying, I can't wait for him to come and all that stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, reflecting back on my oldest son, well, no, just let him come to term. Let him wait till term. I don't want to do another week in the NICU. On that July night, I was actually in Oklahoma City at training. It seems like always my stuff comes around training. I just got up there the day before we had our first class, and I remember getting a call after we got back to the hotel that night, and it was Melanie. And she said she's going into labor and going to the hospital. And I remember thinking to myself, it's too early. My partner at the time drove me back from Oklahoma City, so we had an hour and a half drive, and it was probably 11 or 12 o'clock at night when we left, and bless his heart, he drove all the way back that night to get back to school the next day. And I remember getting down there, they were going through everything and doing the stuff, and basically we were just waiting. I think it was the next day is when my son was born, that next evening. I remember him coming out, and he looked kind of blue, but he was crying. And I thought, well, the fact that he's crying, they didn't rush him off, because when Dalton was born, they immediately rushed him out of the room, and we didn't even get to hold him. But I remember him crying, and he looked blue, and I'm thinking, well, maybe that's the way they looked before, I don't know. But they did their thing with him. They cleaned him up, and they let everyone hold him. But I remember he wouldn't cry as much as he would squeak. The nurses kept monitoring through the night. And eventually, I think it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, they took him out of our room and into the NICU. And they told us that he would go there just to be checked out to make sure everything's okay. That next morning, we get up, and I go to see him in the NICU, and they tell me they're transferring him to Children's Hospital. I remember everything just kind of being a blur at that time. I told them, okay, they were going to have an ambulance on the way, and I would go straight over there and meet him there, and Melanie would get out and get out of the hospital and come over there. I remember they let her go sooner probably than they should have, but they knew that she wanted to be with her child, and we didn't know exactly what was going on. Or once again, when you're in the NICU, they don't tell you anything. All they know is your child's sick, but you don't know what. And we got over there to the hospital, and they were doing things. They had him on breathing machines, and the wires and everything's attached. And it wasn't until then we found out that he had water on the lungs. He didn't have the ability to breathe clearly. And I remember through the whole deal, they kept telling us that he was very sick, but I didn't know what that meant. What I didn't realize at the time was they were telling us to prepare, that he probably wouldn't make it, and I didn't understand that. We didn't see it. We didn't want to see it. We're new parents. What did he do? And once again, I was in that same spot. What did I do that was so wrong that would cause my son to be in this situation? He didn't do anything. Why is he there? And I remember praying that first night when we got to Children's Hospital, give whatever he's got to me. Let me take that. Why? He did nothing. He has done nothing. Let me take that. I don't remember what night it was or how many days we'd been in there. But I remember I got home for a night. It was my night to stay at home. And I just got into the shower and got out and was fixing to get into bed when I got a call. It was from my mother-in-law, and she said I need to get up there. Something had happened. I drove way faster than I should have, but I wanted to get there. It hadn't been too much long before that where my grandmother had passed away from a medical mistake. They had put a feeding tube into her lungs and caused her to die. And my son had a feeding tube. And I knew that they had messed up. I remember getting to the hospital, and they had these glass windows, and I knocked on them. Some say loudly, but I knocked on them, and no one came out, and my wife was out there, and they didn't know what was going on other than something had happened, and they made her leave. Come to find out, his lungs collapsed. First one, and then the other. He's only a few days old, and I'm thinking, why? What is the deal? Why is it that every one of my kids has to go through this? Why? What did I do so wrong? I'm sorry for the things that I've done, but I didn't realize. I didn't understand. Why would this happen? doctor finally came out, escorted with security, kind of told us that, his lungs had collapsed. And I remember him telling us that he wasn't supposed to be there that night, that he was on his day off, but the other doctor that's normally there couldn't come in, was sick, and so he came in for him. And it was a good thing he did, because he was the one that knew the procedure that saved his life. He was still under a breathing machine, or breathing tubes, and all this, and they were going through all these problems, and they still were telling us, be prepared. And I remember my parents were living in New York at the time, and they said, my mom called and spoke to one of the nurses and said, she told her, if you want to see your grandson alive, you need to come now. And I didn't know this at the time, and I didn't realize it, and I didn't want to believe it, but she put him on a prayer list. And my wife's family put him on a prayer list. And she came down and made it down, and everything was going well. But they were still unsure. They still didn't know, but he was on a prayer list. And it wasn't until that prayer list took effect that I started seeing daily improvements in his life. His numbers came up, and whatever it is he had to reach, he would start achieving those. I remember my grandparents used to come up and visit, and they were in their 70s at the time, and in NICU you're not supposed to go in unless the family's there, the parents are there. But I remember them sneaking through a few times and seeing, I know their prayers counted. I know their prayers counted for him, and that's when we started seeing the improvement. That's when we started seeing the change in him, from this frail child to a growing boy. We were in the NICU a total of a month before he finally got to come home. The power of prayer works. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen them tell me that this child never should have made it. If that doctor hadn't been there that night, if the prayers hadn't been prayed, who knows where we'd be today. It'd be a different person than I am right now. But when we say God's got a plan, I know he does. I still didn't go to church after that. I didn't do much of anything other than work and do our thing with a new baby. But I remember we had moved to New York for a short time, and I remember going to church. My parents had started going to church more often, and I remember them asking me, hey, for Father's Day, if you'll just come to church with me. Fine. They didn't have to buy a present. I'd go. Hey, for Mother's Day, Mom didn't like it so much because when my sister moved out, but for this, Easter, for Christmas, just come to church with us. And I did it to appease them. I wasn't really into it, but I didn't know at the time that I was still searching and what I was searching for. I'd taken a job in New York and worked up there for a short time and had an opportunity to come back. And because of some things that happened, and these things that had happened weren't good things, they weren't, but they would play a part to changing my life and the life of some of my family. We came back to Oklahoma in 2012, and I remember we had no money because I had no job yet. My wife had got a job, a little that paid very, very little. We had a place to stay. We had, everything. We moved across country again in 2 years, second time in 2 years. We moved across country, and I remember thinking, what are we going to do? We have nothing to do. We have no money. My job didn't start for another month almost. And we had nothing to do. And I remember my mom telling me that there was a church and it had a really good band. I thought, they have Saturday service, let's go. Something to do. It's like going to a concert. And we started going to church on Saturdays. And it was great. It was a great church. It was great service, great music. But what I didn't realize is how it would affect me and how it would change my life. You know, my son's about 2 years old at this point, and he starts talking, and I start realizing how close it was, how close it could have been. And I start seeing through my past that I've been searching for something, and I just didn't know what it was. I'd won awards for taking pictures. I remember seeing the beauty of stuff. I remember looking for something that I didn't find it in work. I didn't find it in anything else. But I was looking for something. Well, as I started going to church, I heard an old familiar voice one day in the middle of service. It was the same voice I heard that day on 19th Street, telling me to go give a message to a church that thought I was too young to do. And it was very simple. It said, read your Bible. I heard it again and again. And finally I said, okay. I gave in. I said, I'll read it. But if I want to read it, I want to read it cover to cover. And I want to read it on my time. So I get an app and I start looking for Bible plans, and there's the 1 year. I was like, nah, I want to read it faster than that. And 6 months. Okay, maybe that one. Then I found one right underneath that said 90 days. Read the Bible in 90 days. I've never read the whole thing. I've never read the book. So I took the time and I read it. I gave every waking moment I had, but I read it in 90 days. Front to back. Didn't understand a tenth of it. I read it in New King James. I remember a buddy of mine said, when he heard that I was reading the Bible, he says, what'd you think of Psalms? Or Songs of Solomon? I said, oh, it was good. He goes, you didn't read it, did you? I said, yeah, I read it. I don't remember what it was about, but I read it. And he goes, what version did you read it in? And I said, New King James. Because that's what I had when I was a kid. New King James. He goes, now, read it in the language you understand. I said, but I like New King James. He goes, read it in the language you can understand. And that's when I learned to read in a language I could understand, because though I read it cover to cover and I got a lot out of it, not as much as when I started studying it. You know, we grew closer as a family when I started this, and I remember wanting to go to church every time it was open. You know, in Easter about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, I got baptized for the first time. I remember it was around Easter baptism at this church we were going to, and I remember them saying at the end of the service, the pastor was giving the explanation of where to go and what to do, how it was going to work. And he says that when we dismiss you, you're going to stand up, you're going to go out these doors here, you're going to go down this hallway, and you're going to do this. And I remember as soon as he said that, I stood up, and no one else did. And he kind of laughs, and he said, well, go ahead. And so I was out the door, and I got baptized that night again with my son, my oldest son. And that started the new life for me. That started the change. I remember once I really dedicated my life to Christ, I decided I got to do something. There's something I've got to be doing. I've got to serve. I've read the Bible now. I'm starting to study the Bible. I'm starting to understand more. But there's got to be more that I'm supposed to be doing. And I had an opportunity to serve. I remember they had a deal, come serve at church. I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And I decided to serve that time. And I volunteered to be an usher, one of the guys at Setcha and did that stuff. And the day before I was scheduled for my first day of service, I got a call of a suicide. I was an investigator. Got a call of a suicide, and the guy had used a large vehicle to kill himself inside a garage with carbon monoxide. And I remember that night we had aired out the garage, and he had his contraption hooked up to the car, and we go to pull the body out of this guy who had basically lost everything and given up on life. And I remember opening that door, and somehow there was still some carbon monoxide left, and I I took a hit of it, and I remember coughing and having a difficulty time breathing. After that incident, I went to church that Saturday, and I served. And then for the next month, I was on an oxygen tank. I had burned out the top portions of my lungs with that hit of carbon monoxide from one man in his life. And it very well could have ended mine. But that's okay, because to me, I was saved at that point. I was truly saved. I'd truly given my life to the Lord. I decided to start serving Him. And it took on a whole different meaning from the times in the past when I thought about that I could have died and I worried about it, and I started looking at the fact now that I've given my life. It's okay. I know that doesn't really make sense, but it was okay. After a month of that or so, I was talking to a friend of mine who was a youth pastor, and he needed some help, and he asked me to come help him. So I did. I started going to his church and started helping out there. I wanted to serve. I wanted to serve wherever I could. Eventually, I became an associate pastor of the church. And every year, as my son got older, I was reminded of the miracle of his birth and the things we went through it in the NICU. And I felt this calling on my life to do more, to serve in some capacity. And the Lord kept leading me towards this ministry, and I'm thinking, well, I'm doing ministry now. I'm an associate pastor. I'm helping here. I'm doing this. And He said, that's not it. It's not where you're supposed to be right now. You're supposed to be here for a time to learn something. And I remember at this time hearing the voice so clearly. In fact, we were driving down the highway one time. We were going to do something. I remember the voice saying, go buy Bibles. I didn't know, what? Why am I going to buy Bibles? And everything fell in place. But I wanted to be faithful to the Lord. And so I said, okay, I'll buy Bibles. And we went to Mardell and bought a case of them. We ended up offering them just about anywhere we could. Every time you go through a drive-thru, hey, here's your French fries. Would you like a Bible? We had a friend that needed them. And by happenstance, I had them. And by the plan of God, I had them. And I gave some to him. And we gave some out. And we did something with them. But looking back, it's all times where God is telling me, just say yes. Say yes to my plan for you. And it's going to be so much greater than you realized. And I decided that I was going to start saying yes to God. Whatever He told me He wanted me to do, that's what I was going to do. I was associate pastoring. I was helping out. I would be working the sound booth. I would help at youth camp, and I would help at all these different things. And occasionally I'd get up and preach on a Sunday or a Wednesday. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And then God reminded me one anniversary of my son being born, his birthday, that I have other plans for you. And that other plan for you is going to take you out of your comfort zone. I want you to start a ministry. And I'm thinking, but I'm already in ministry. I'm doing. And He said, no. This goes beyond the church. This is what you need to start doing. And I said, because I had agreed to say yes. I was going to say yes to whatever God had planned for me. And the voice was as clear as day. And it was comfortable for me to be at that church because the community was already there, and all I had to do was show up and teach and get to study and learn the Word and teach it. And it was everything I thought I'd wanted at the time. And God decided, no, that's not it. You're going to do more. I remember talking to the pastor about it and telling him that this is what God wanted me to do, and he was understanding. He said, okay, go. And I was like, it's really comfortable for me to be here. I don't want to leave yet. And he said, if God's telling you to go, you got to go. So we did. We started. And we started as a NICU ministry. And we started, that was our goal, is to help those who've been in a situation like us. One of the things when God tells you to do something, he only shows you a portion of it, and it's your faith that takes you to it. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. I get all this set up. I'm ready to go. How am I going to get in the NICU? You have to be invited. You can't just go. I talked to the hospitals. I tried to coordinate with their staff on things we could do for the families of the NICU, get stuff together. And I was shot down at every corner. Everywhere I went, I was shot down. I thought, well, what am I supposed to do? You have this plan for me. You have this, what you want me to do. How am I supposed to do it if I can't even get in? And I remember him saying, it'll work out. It'll happen. He said, but there's more for you to do. And I realized that in my meantime, while I was waiting for these opportunities to serve in one form or fashion or another, that there was more I could do. We started with homeless missions and Bible and working poor, and since then we've grown and grown and grown and done more. We've coordinated with churches all throughout our area. We've coordinated with other ministries. We've worked together. And I remember God speaking to me and saying, read the book of Acts and Romans. It's what we did. It's what they did in the first century church. It's how I was supposed to do my ministry. And that's what I based it off of. And from that point, that's what we've done. Wherever God has called us to work, wherever He's called us to do, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us feel, because we don't grow if we're comfortable, but we grow when we're uncomfortable. If God says to do something, just say yes. And that's what I chose to do. And that's where we ended up where we are. My life is full of mistakes and problems and living in a world of evil and surrounded by it. And I could have very easily turned to any number of other things to cope with that. But I found myself that I was looking for something beautiful. I was looking for something in this world to hold on to remember my humanity, remember the love that I used to have for things and people that I was losing on a daily basis. But I'm bombarded by this evil and these problems of this world, and then my son comes along. Both of them have these terrible times. I'm thinking, what do I do? But as I look back and see the things that I did, I see the plan that God had for me, that had that doctor not been there that night, my son might not have made it. Had my first son come along, should I have answered the call? Yes, I should have answered the call when I was 20-something years old, but I didn't know what I was doing. I was lost. I didn't think. I wasn't spiritual. I wasn't in the Word. It's important for us to remember that and to focus on the Word. And when God speaks to us, and He does speak, He still speaks to this day. Sometimes it's in word that you can hear. Sometimes it's in your heart and a feeling. But we've got to say yes to it, because the things that I've experienced over my years, the near losses and the loss of friends and family, and the horrors that I've seen could have easily turned me in another direction. But I can see now, as I look back, all the things that God's done in my life that's brought me to this point. I see the miracles, the little daily miracles that He gives us, little daily miracles that He's done in our lives to help us when sometimes we didn't realize it was there. From losing a house to gaining something more, from nearly losing a son to following in the footsteps of the Lord. And that's where I want to be. That's where our ultimate reward is. Yeah, there's still struggles, there's still problems, there's still daily fights and things that we deal with. But one of the greatest joys I had, something that I'd never seen. A couple of years ago, my wife and I started fostering. And we fell in love with these kids, and we were blessed a year after fostering them to make them part of our family. And we adopted them into our family, and they are like one with us. And it's such an amazing thing to do. It's such an amazing feeling to have. I've always wanted a large family, and to have my sons and daughters now. Now there's 8 of us. And some people think, well, that's a lot of kids. But man, it is the greatest blessing that I have. And those we have struggles and we have fights like every brother and sister have. We have problems. But God has blessed us with these opportunities. With the opportunity not only to raise these kids, but raise our kids together as one family, the way God is the Father for all of us. So we should be for our families. We should put Him number one. And if we put Him number one, we start seeing the things that He's done for us. We start living our life the way God wants us to live it. And if it wasn't for the grace of God, I don't know where I'd be today. I probably wouldn't be sitting here doing this right now. But that's the miracle of God in this world, the miracle that still exists, the miracles that He still does every single day in your life and in my life and the lives around us. But we got to stop and we got to look at it and we got to remember what He's doing for us. It only takes a minute and to believe and to understand and to pray. But seek God first. Put God number one in our lives, in our families, in our jobs, and He will make everything work for His good. And what a wonderful good it is.